going to talk about political economy of labor control and coercion. I thought of trying to survey some area which I think would have been nice, but at the end I sort of, I'm not very good at surveying things and putting them together in that way. So I thought instead I'll try to share my thoughts with some references to the literature on how to interpret a number of patterns, in particular and historical patterns about development and political economy, in particular in some way somewhat of a different interpretation that that has been forming in my mind over the past few years. And oops, okay, it's not on. Okay, now all right, perfect. So in particular, you know, this became apparent to me when I started thinking about kind of going back to labor markets, and where I did a little bit of work in the 1990s, and I sort of realized that almost all of the models that we have of the labor market are a very imperfect or poor approximation to almost all of the historical labor markets that, you know, the world has known, and it is those labor markets that have shaped the nature of many of the societies and still continue to shape. And in particular, this is very well kind of captured by Finley when he was commenting on Angerman Vogel's book, of which Finley was very critical, and that's in the context of slavery in the United States, and it's where the slavery was called the peculiar institution, and Finley writes, in the context of universal in history, free labor and wage labor is the peculiar institution. So essentially, this captures, I think, in a succinct way, a quick history of the world labor markets, which is that throughout history, you know, it's very rare to see places in which you have wage labor, and even when you have wage labor, it's almost always based on some sort of coercion in the background. And this is true if you look at you know, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, Rome, almost all of the several Islamic societies, much of Africa before contact with the Europeans, as so far as we know, all the Asian empires, and of course in Europe up to the 19th century, you know, even in England where, you know, there were major reforms, things like the Master Servants Act was repealed only, you know, late in the 19th century. So the question is, how does it change, how should it change the way that we think about A, labor markets, and B, how we should change the way that we think about political economy of growth, if at all. And the argument I would sort of make is that, you know, in some sense, a lot of the political economy ideas that we have, which I think are still appropriate and valid, but they are derived from this view that political economy conflicts are often about things such as minerals, natural resources. You know, always we talk about natural resources and how much conflict they create because some country might have diamonds. And absolutely right, you know, diamonds create a lot of conflict. But again, when you think about how historical societies have been shaped, you know, the thing that they were trying to control and coerce much more often wasn't, you know, minerals. You know, they were trying to do that, but to do the minerals, you actually need labor. So they were trying to control labor, and most often it was tribute, agricultural tribute, and again, the crucial thing for that was labor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to illustrate that this is the case a little bit with some historical examples. In that process, also trying to give you some clues about how, in my mind, this seems to have played out in shaping the sort of institutions that we observe around the world coming to the kind of 20th century and also in the 20th century. And then I'll talk a little bit about you know, some models emphasizing three distinct aspects. The third one I'm not going to have much time to talk about at all, but I'll give a little bit of detail about how labor coercion sort of is very different in the sense that it creates both different comparative statics and different welfare effects than many of the models that we are used to. I'll talk about how when labor is the most important commodity, then there are going to be a lot of incentives to try to manipulate its price. and how that actually takes a much more inefficient form than other forms of extraction. So I'll try to be very explicit about that. So those are sort of two ideas that I'll try to kind of put on the table, that political economy of labor coercion might actually be much more inefficient and much more pernicious in terms of its growth consequences than even the sort of the usual distributional conflicts that we are used to. And then I'll have a little bit to say about politics of coercion, in what way this actually might be different. And then I'll talk a little bit about, what are the things that end coercion? So how do societies transform themselves from being coercive and based on labor coercion to sort of to societies where there is wage labor or much more prevalent wage labor. So let me start with a sort of an anecdote, which I think is very kind of representative of the colonization patterns in Latin America. So together with the colonization of the Inca and the Aztec empires, of course, the Spaniards were also trying to colonize the southern end of the continent, and Juan Díaz de Solís colonized the Rio de Plata at the beginning of the 16th century. And one of his deputies, Mendoza, so essentially founded the Buenos Aires where it is today in 1532. So one might think that that would be a very attractive place for the Spaniards, in the sense that that's where the climate is very nice. We like Buenos Aires much better than many other cities in Latin America, because it's got it's a climate that's very similar to what Europeans are used to. You might think that the Spaniards might have done the same thing, and it's surrounded by very fertile areas, today. But actually, things worked out very differently for de Solís and Mendoza, essentially because their model of colonization was the same one as Spaniards used in the Incas and the Aztecs, and the British tried to use in North America, which is we go there and we find people to put to work, and they're going to work for us. They're going to find gold. They're going to mine gold and silver, but most importantly, they're going to produce food for us, and we're going to tax them. And so it was this classic case of trying to find the laborers to coerce, because that was the most important resource in some sense for them. That was the way to get silver and gold. And but what they actually encountered there were hunter-gatherer Indians, the two tribes, Cheruas and the Guarani. And first of all, they were very sparsely settled, so even if they could control them, that wouldn't have done too much good for them. Secondly, it's that these were very mobile, very hard to put to work. So the Spaniards tried to capture them and put to work, and at the end, they were totally unsuccessful. In fact, de Solís was soon killed by them, and a couple of years later, the Spaniards had left that entire area, and they didn't go back and settle. Instead, they went up the river to where is Paraguay today. They found more settled, more numerous, less sparsely settled Indians, the Guarani. It was much easier for them to capture the Guarani because they were more densely settled than the Cheruas and the Guarani, but more importantly also, they already had developed methods of labor coercion. They had a very hierarchical structure which was run by an elite, and the elite already coerced the labor, collected tribute. Servile labor of sorts was very common, and what the Spaniards did is essentially they took that over, and that was a very vibrant colony for them, whereas Buenos Aires remained totally marginal. And so this is essentially a sort of indicative of the general colonization pattern that the Spaniards tried to adopt throughout Latin America, and in fact all of the Europeans tried to. And this is the sort of the right interpretation, in my opinion, of the pattern that Jim, Simon, and I sort of documented in a paper called "The Reversal of Fortune." And essentially, we found that if you look at any other period or many other subsamples, you see things are fairly persistent. Baghdad doesn't predict, Industrial Revolution. But if you look at 200, 300 years, the places that are more urbanized or richer in some sense tend to be richer. There's a mean reversion, but they tend to be richer. When you look at the former colonies from the 1500s, before the European colonization, to today, you see the reverse pattern, that the places that were more prosperous as measured by urbanization are actually less prosperous today. And that's essentially like the Argentina-Paraguay comparison. Argentina was much less quite prosperous in the sense that it was much less civilized, much less developed than places like the Incas or the Aztecs or even the area that today makes up Paraguay, and they were subject to a different colonization pattern. And in fact, at first we thought, well, we'll look at another variable, population density, as another measure of prosperity rather than urbanization. There are many reasons why population density may not be a good measure of prosperity, but we thought, well, we'll try it in any case. But then, after a short while, we kind of said, well, actually, not just as another measure of prosperity, but this seems like this might be the channel through which this works. And we provided some additional evidence suggesting that, population, the reason why the more prosperous places ended up to becoming relatively poorer after the 200-300 years of European colonization is precisely that the more prosperous places were the ones that were more densely settled, and more densely settled were places were colonized in a very different way. So essentially, this is what we sort of thought at the time, which still is a fair characterization of my thinking on this, which is that high population density, by providing a supply of labor that could be forced to work in agricultural mining, made extractive institutions more attractive for Europeans. And I think what I've sort of been thinking more about is that this is much more widely true in many other settings, not just in the context of colonization. There's a recent very interesting book, for example, by James Scott called The Art of Not Being Governed, where he makes the argument that the entire history of East Asia is essentially shaped by this same kind of forces, which is that all these East Asian empires are trying to control and coerce these large supply of labor. They're at the same time trying to increase the supply of labor and trying to coerce it. And the political dynamics in South Asia or Southeast Asia is largely shaped by these by the conflict between many little tribes that are trying to protect themselves from the authority of the state versus the capability of centralized states like the Chinese, the Burmese, and so on and so forth. And there are other parallels actually in Africa and so on, but let me not talk too much about that. The story of feudalism is not all that different. European feudalism is also mainly a system of coercion. Actually, this is not uncontroversial. There are many different theories of feudalism, and some of them emphasize other military aspects and so on. But I think at the heart of it is really a system of coercion. And when you actually think of the collapse of feudalism, it's quite clear, at least according to my reading, that its coercion was associated with its inability, with a diminution in its diminishing ability to control coercion. So in particular, one event or one set of events is very prevalent in many accounts of the decline of feudalism. So it's the Black Death and the associated decline in population. And the Neo-Malthusian story, for example, as associated by Habakkuk Poston, North and Thomas, and so on, is that this actually increased wages, and higher wages made coercion less tenable. It's not actually quite clear why this is the case. There is some evidence that wages actually increased, but it's not clear what the economic mechanism is, from higher wages to less coercion or harder coercion. And even it's not clear what the mechanism for higher wages is, because this was not a labor supply, labor equals labor demand diagram. And in fact, in other places where coercive labor is very common, you don't see a similar sort of relationship. So this is, Black Death was a major event. It may have killed up to 2/3 of the population, perhaps a half of the population. But of course, Europeans bringing diseases to to South America actually killed more, perhaps 80, perhaps some people even say 90% of the population. But what happens to wages as the population is falling? Well, all the existing evidence we have suggests that there wasn't any increase in wages. And this is not surprising. There was just all of these workers were paid wages, so they were sort of wage laborers, but they were subject to extensive coercion. And you actually also see coercive activity increase around this time where labor is becoming less scarce. So you see that for looking at a variety of different wage series. So I think we need to sort of think about these issues. I think it's also important to underscore that these coercive institutions they're not something in history that don't have any effect anymore. So many of these practices have, I think, shaped the way that politics in these societies have developed, and they have also shaped the way that political economy has developed. And in particular, for instance, recent paper by Melissa Dell that's came out in Econometrica, uses one of these examples of coercive structures in Latin America, the forced labor system that the Spaniards set up in the Mita system, the coercive labor system, Mita system that set up in the Potosi mine, which is in current-day Peru and Bolivia, and using a regression discontinuity design about whether a village is close to the border, but one side on the catchment area of the forced labor system. She's able to identify a fairly precise and fairly large effects of, this is not the best picture, this is one of her old pictures actually, but the other ones are three-dimensional, so I have a hard time explaining them, which was about 20 to 25% lower consumption in places that were just in the catchment areas versus the places that were just out of the catchment areas. And this is, centuries after the formal coercive structures have been abolished. But the other evidence that she provides suggests that there were other aspects of this that sort of persisted, in the sense that in the areas where coercive labor was prevalent, the entire labor market developed differently, and the entire system of roads and transport developed very differently, and market relations developed very differently. So I think these are sort of some ideas suggesting that we might need to think about labor coercion a little more, and its effects may be sort of important. So to do that, I'm going to, how much time do I have, Guido? 25 minutes. Okay, so I want to quickly go through two channels. And to do that, rather than talk through it, I'm just going to give a few elements of the model, because I think it sort of clarifies things. And I'll just give two different models. And one of them is based on work that I did with Alex Wolitsky. And essentially, it's about introducing coercion in a principal-agent relationship. And the idea is, essentially, we think of a relationship between an employer, say landlord, and a worker. And the landlord tries to extract some labor effort from the worker. So it's a principal-agent-like relationship. But in addition, there's a coercive element to it. And in particular, the way that we sort of think about this is very similar to a standard principal-agent relationship. The worker puts some effort. As a result of that effort, he can be successful or unsuccessful. There is some reward or punishment as a result of this. But in addition, there is also some coercive activity, G, and this G is different from punishment. The key problem, so punishments you can have, so there have been some papers in the principal-agent literature. I think the most interesting one is by Michael Chue, which introduces kind of punishments in a principal-agent relationship, and it leads to a bunch of interesting results. And that's obviously sort of a coercive thing at some level, in the sense that you can ex post use punishments after a bad outcome, and that might change the effort incentives. But really, what is the key point of the coercive relationship that I've been sort of hinting at? Well, it is that, coercion is used to make workers accept employment on terms that they wouldn't accept otherwise. So the key thing of the forced labor in the Mita wasn't that people, once they went to the mine, might actually be beaten up because they weren't working hard enough. That was obviously important. But the key thing was that, and that was the main reason why the Spaniards wanted to use this forced labor system, is that they wouldn't be able to get these people to work in the mine for the wages that they were willing to offer. And the reason why wages don't shoot up, I think, in Mexico after this large population decline is that those wages are not the thing that clear the labor market. It's a wage and coercion combination. So therefore, it's not just enough to introduce punishments into a principal-agent relationship. You really need to have coercion affect the terms of trade. So how do you do that? So the simplest way of doing that is to say that this G, these guns, affect the participation constraint of the worker. So essentially, this is what we do. We think of a situation where if the agent tries to run away from the relationship or doesn't accept the terms of the relationship, she gets some U bar, which you can think of her as her extrinsic outside option, but minus G, so the G is being used in order to change the terms of trade, i.e. the participation constraint. Okay? And there's an effort between 0 and 1, some cost C of A, and A is also the probability of success, so this is a very simple formulation of the principal-agent relationship. And what does the principal obtain from this relationship? She obtains some output which he can sell at the price P, if and Y is the realization of output, has to make some payments as a function of the realization of output, W of Y, and then pays for guns. What about the agent? The agent gets the wage. There might be some punishment in the relationship and also pays the cost of effort. Okay? But if she turns it down, she gets U bar minus G. So this is a fairly straightforward principal-agent relationship. You don't need to go through the math, but I'll just write it here, that it's going to essentially have a solution, which is that the principal maximizes its utility. So there are two outcomes with probability A. It's successful, so you get the output and you pay the wage. With 1 minus A, it's not successful. You may have to pay the wage, and you pay the cost for guns. Then there is an IC constraint, which makes sure that the agent puts the effort that's necessary. And then there is a participation or IR constraint, which makes sure that the agent participates, and that's where the G comes in. So this is the cost of effort. So it turns out that this problem actually has a fairly nice structure, and in particular, it is a supermodular problem. And the reason why it's supermodular is very related to the nature to the nature of the coercive relationship. So if there was no coercion, this wouldn't be supermodular. And the reason why it's supermodular essentially is that you want to do more coercion when there is more effort. And why is that? Well, essentially, think of the case in which effort is equal to 1. When effort is equal to 1, you have to pay the worker its outside option. So this, any savings you can do from its outside option is very useful. On the other hand, go to the other extreme where effort is equal to 0. Well, the worker is going to be against the limited liability constraint. So the G is not that useful. So the closer you are to the first extreme, then the more valuable is coercion. So that's the supermodularity in A and G. So what does that imply? Well, it implies one thing that's, I think, is going to be, it's going to imply that the analysis can be done in a simple way, but it also implies a particular sort of relationship between outside options and coercion that I think is ex ante not so obvious, but I think ex post very robust. And that's that if you look at this problem and you say, well, which agent do you expect to be coerced more? An agent that has a high U bar or an agent who has a low U bar? Well, your first instinct might be, actually, an agent who has a high U bar should be coerced more, because what you're doing is that you're using the coercion in order to reduce the net outside option. In fact, the very robust result is the exact opposite, that an agent who has a low U bar is coerced more. And why is that? Because an agent who has a low U bar is the one from which you want to extract more labor. But if you want to extract more labor, that's the complementarity that I said comes from the logic of coercion. This complementarity says that that's when you want to coerce them more. So So therefore, and this is, this is the baseline model, so this is true in a variety of variations of this model. This effect comes in very robustly, that you actually want to coerce workers that have low outside option. Now, you can see that this is going to have a bunch of implications. Like, in societies where labor is coerced, that's where you want to do more coercion, because that's where wages are low, that's where outside options are low, because there are no alternatives, and so on and so forth. So it sort of might suggest the different workings of the labor market in places where coercion is true. It also suggests a bunch of easy implications that are, I think, useful for thinking about the problem. One is that, the first one I've already mentioned, the easier coercion leads to higher effort. So if all you do is you look at measured output, you might actually overestimate the quote-unquote efficiency of models that are coercive, because you're looking at observed output. But exactly, they are coercive because they're trying to extract effort. And in fact, they are more coercive when there's more effort through the complementarity that I've mentioned. So these are going to appear efficient, but then that's that's sort of the effects on the agents is exactly the opposite. In fact, agents are always worse off when there is coercion. Why? Because the agents are going to get their IR constraints going to be binding, so that's an immediate result. And moreover, the agents are worse off when they are matched with more productive agents. Again, in imperfect labor market, we have a large literature on imperfect labor markets. That's where I was starting from in the 1990s. I thought, well, one robust predictions of these that away from the competitive markets, be it efficiency wages or bargaining, you're better off when you are matched with more productive firms because you rent share with them. It's exactly the opposite. When you're matched with more productive firms, you're worse off. Why? Because they are the ones who want to coerce you more because your effort is most valuable to them. So again, the comparative statics are sort of very different. And and if we start kind of going a little bit more deeper into it, in some sense, they might be a little more sort of interesting as well. First of all, the effort is not only higher under coercion, it might even be greater than the first best. But more importantly, it's actually the effect on the agent welfare always dominates. So the aggregate welfare is always lower because of coercion. Again, that's sort of intuitive ex post because coercion is purely a rent-seeking activity. You're not doing anything. You're just doing it in order to shift rents. So you're wasting resources on it. A sort of an important, so these are sort of useful for interpreting some of the effects that, for instance, Fogel and Engelman were putting a lot of emphasis on, productivity in the labor markets and so on and so forth. One of the things that Fogel and Engelman, for instance, put a lot of emphasis on was that after the data are not great, but they emphasized that at the end of the slavery, wages did not increase. And so they said, well, this kind of is prima facie evidence that slavery, wasn't such an awful system. People were getting more or less the same wages. So one implication of this is that, in fact, wages might decrease after coercion is banned. And that makes coercion no less inefficient. Why is that? Well, because in coercion, what you're doing in coercion is you're getting much more effort from the worker. You have to compensate him. So even with coercion, you might actually end up paying higher wages. Coercion disappears, wages actually decline, but everybody is way better off. So again, looking at wages, because you're comparing different institutional structure is actually not the right thing. So let me now use this model to think a little bit about the decline of labor coercion. So in some sense, the neo-Malthusian kind of idea that I gave is only half of the story. And in particular, a very famous paper by F.Z. Domar on slavery and serfdom essentially said, put up the hypothesis that coercion emerged as a way of saving on expensive labor. So the Domar, for example, wrote, I would expect to find a positive statistical correlation between free land and serfdom. So where labor is scarce, that's where you expect serfdom to be. It's exactly the opposite of the neo-Malthusian hypothesis. So in some sense, there is something wrong, or at least we need to have some way of thinking about them. It's actually very interesting that these two hypotheses have been banged in the literature for, over, 30 years, 35 years? Oh, yeah, 40 years. And except one economic historian, or one historian is not an economic historian, people sort of didn't make too much of the contrast of these two hypotheses. And that one person that didn't actually start from Domar, but it was just criticizing the neo-Malthusian theory, and that was Brenner. It had a major effect in history, but not so much in economic history, because Brenner was a Marxist historian, so it didn't actually kind of travel so much into economics, I guess. And essentially, this kind of led to a Brenner debate or Brenner critique. Essentially, Brenner said, well, these neo-Malthusian stories don't make much sense because we see these population declines in many places, but in some of them it leads to the collapse of feudalism. In some others, like the Eastern Europe or even some other parts of Europe and some other episodes, it actually leads to intensification of coercion. And in Eastern Europe, for instance, following, it's somewhat delayed, but there was a second serfdom where things became much more onerous for the serfs. And essentially the model, I think, is very simple, but sort of helps us think through these effects. And in fact, they are not inconsistent. They're just two different comparative statics in some sense. The first one, I think, is that the one that Domar has in mind is the price effect. So going back to this model here, this is increasing the P here. When you increase P, that, of course, increases the demand for labor and increases coercion. Why does P increase? That's exactly Domar's channel. There's a lot of land that increases the demand for products that are produced with land. What I think the neo-Malthusian had in mind was this U-bar channel, which is that labor is becoming scarce in the rest of the economy, and as a result, its outside option is increasing. But what did we see? The outside option effect tells us that when the outside option goes up, then we're going to have that coercion is going to go down. So labor scarcity is going to increase outside option and make coercion less likely. And so why would we expect, so this was one way of making sense of Domar versus the neo-Malthusians. How would we make sense of neo-Malthusians versus Brenner? Well, think of Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. Where do you expect the price effect to be stronger? Where do you expect the outside option effect to be stronger? Well, Eastern Europe was producing grain for the rest of Europe, so that's where the price effect is going to be fairly important. Where is the outside option effect coming from? From an outside sector, because inside sector logic, I've said already explained, it goes in reinforcing the effect. So it's got to come from an outside sector. But in Eastern Europe, the cities and the outside sector were much more minor, much more limited than Western Europe at the time of the big population decline. So that's one way of kind of trying to explain both the sort of Domar versus neo-Malthusians and neo-Malthusians versus Brenner through the lenses of this model. So let me, so I have 10, how much? 10 minutes. So let me be much more brief about the next model and just say it in words rather than kind of show you the math. And essentially, what I try to argue here is that it's not only overt coercion. So the previous model was about the overt coercion of labor. And overt coercion of labor not only leads, if you buy into it, to a bunch of new comparative statics, perhaps a somewhat different way of thinking about how the labor market works, but it also leads to different comparative statics, and it leads to a lot more inefficiencies because, A, you have a direct mechanism for extracting rents, and this direct mechanism causes a lot of declines in utility through punishments and a variety of things, in addition to all of the distortions, all of the margins are not what they should be. So the second thing that I want to argue is that even if there isn't an explicit coercion, if your main purpose in controlling political power is to control labor, that's going to lead to a lot of distortions as well. And to do that, what I do is I just set up a very simple model in which there are two distinct groups in the society, which you might think as middle class and elite. That's what the labels that I use, but it could be city versus countryside. One application that you can think of this is the nice discussion by Egertson of the Iceland fisheries. This would be the fisheries versus the agriculture in Iceland. And essentially two potential sectors, sets of distinct employers that want to employ labor. And but one of them has political power. Now, once you have political power, you can try to rig things in your favor. So the first thing you can do, and that's the one that we are very familiar with in our model, which is you can set taxes on the other party in order to extract resources from the other party. And if you want to think of the kind of the cleanest case of this, and I'm not showing you the math, but It's very, very simple. If you want to think of the cleanest case of this in the context of this model, you want to think of the case where the wage is constant. Say the wage is either exogenously constant or there's an excess supply, so it's at the lowest level that it can be. Then the only reason why you're going to use tax instruments is to extract resources from the other side. It turns out that you want to do some of that, but you don't want to do too much of it, and that's just the standard Laffer curve reasoning. You don't want to go beyond the top of the Laffer curve. And moreover, if you can do anything that makes the other side of the economy productive, you like to do that, because if they become productive, they produce more, you can extract more from them. But what if you also take into account that the other side of the economy, the fisheries in Iceland or the middle class in the cities in Middle Ages Europe, also is competing against you for labor demand? Well, then the situation is much worse, because you realize that every time they are able to produce, they're going to demand labor, and that's going to push up wages. Now you cannot directly coerce wages so that labor so that wages are low, but you can indirectly try to do that by affecting the potential employers of labor. So the result is, A, you're going to tax much more. In fact, in the simple model, you want to tax so much that you shut down the other sector. If anything that you can do that will make the other sector less productive, you would like to do it. The opposite of you want to make them more productive. And of course, the distortions that will result from political economy are just going to be much more extensive in a model like this. So the first model was you can directly try to coerce labor. So here I'm saying you cannot coerce labor, but what you can do is you can do your usual taxation through sectors or different goods, and both of them lead to widespread inefficiencies that we often don't think in terms of the political economy models so much, and they tend to be, at least in the stylized examples that I showed, much more damaging than the standard inefficiencies that we've sort of looked at these things. Politics of labor control and coercion. I don't have that much time left, so let me just say a few things that once you take this perspective, and again, at this point, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the perspective, but I think it's one perspective that we should sort of think more about. Political economy conflicts start having much more, many different dimensions. For instance, there's going to be a lot of reason for using overwhelming force. Why? Because you're trying to control a large group of people in society. There might also be increasing returns to scale, especially if there can be cleavages, ethnic cleavages in society, because the larger you get, the larger will be the set of people that you can control. So again, some of the things that James Scott, for example, emphasizes in the context of Southeast Asia is how rice-based agriculture leading to this kind of population of both the oppressed and the oppressors sort of shape the political dynamics in these areas. There are a bunch of other things that are important in the context of politics of coercion, but let me sort of mention two things which relates to the politics of, which one of them relates to the politics of coercion, and end there without taking too much more of your time, which is that, how does labor coercion end? Already I have given you one set of ideas about that, which is related to sort of labor scarcity sometimes leading to the end of coercion. But in some sense, I would say that while the model I presented gave some comparative statics that might be useful, it's not necessarily the right model because it doesn't have any of the politics of coercion. And in particular, in that model, everything is through comparative statics. You go from more coercion to less coercion. But in some sense, the European experience obviously is like that. It's not a kind of an entirely discontinuous break, but it's somewhat more discontinuous in the sense that feudalism is abolished, and that's a landshed event, landmark event in the way that the labor market works, and there is much more trade in the labor market as a result of these changes. So there's some other kind of dynamics perhaps that need to be considered, and I think there are two interesting ones that I've thought about. One of them is related to technology, and this somewhat relates to the issue that Joel already mentioned. And to illustrate that, let me look at one other case of labor repression, which is the U.S. South, which is, in the U.S. South, this is more controversial, but, arguably labor coercion went on until the 1960s, not until the end of the Civil War, because, after the Civil War, Southern elites were able to set up a system that essentially more or less replicated what the slavery did, but without the slavery. When did that system come to an end? In the 1960s? Well, there were two crucial things that happened in that process, that preceded that process. I don't know whether either of them are causal, but let me kind of argue that there are at least mechanisms that might link them. So one of them is that cotton got, the main thing that coercive labor was used was called cotton picking. Cotton picking got much more mechanized. It's very late, actually. Mechanization only starts in the 1940s. Why? Well, I'll come to that in a second. But you see, from 1940s to 1960, there's a very sharp increase, especially in the Delta states in Mississippi, Louisiana. And essentially, we're on a path where almost all of the labor is going to be ultimately picked mechanically. So why is that important? Well, of course, when you have less dependence on labor, then the need for labor coercion is going to be lower. So that's kind of a natural comparative study from these models. And I think the interesting thing there is that there's a feedback effect, which is that the institutional system and the technologies that you're adopting, how quickly you're adopting cotton picking, is of course a function of the prices that you face. And in that context, of course, this is again right in the middle of another debate, which is the neoclassical versus Habakkuk. If you write down most of the neoclassical models of technology adoption that economists have developed, they predict that labor abundance is good for technology adoption. So through a market size effect or to a relative price effect, capital labor. On the other hand, the Habakkuk channel, which was that England fell behind, United States went ahead, was labor scarcity made technology more attractive. That was Habakkuk's argument, and that's essentially what Allen is now, which is what Joel argued, Allen is now sort of pushing for the Industrial Revolution. So, but in fact, it turns out that these two things are also not contradictory to each other. They're again somewhat different comparative statics, and so you can have the sort of models in which labor costs affect labor-saving technologies, and labor-saving technologies then affect coercion. That hasn't been done, but the two parts of this has been done. The two kind of together hasn't been done. That might be some interesting area to think about. The other thing, of course, is that the kind of the coercive system in the South didn't disappear voluntarily. So I think it was a sort of partly a response to a big demand for a change in the institutions in the South. So this is some index of kind of collective actions in the South, and you can see that there is kind of a major spike in what's going on, and this is obviously the very well-known civil rights history. I mean, essentially, this is the sort of theory that Jim and I try to sort of develop between in the context of democratization, but I think it's also applicable when you start thinking of in the context of labor coercion, especially because that's a much more conflictual topic, and you have this sharp distinction that a large group is being coerced by a small group, and the question is when can they solve the collective action problem, and if they can solve the collective action problem, that's going to change the political dynamics a lot. But let me not take more time since I think I'm running out of time. So essentially what I wanted to argue is that, if we want to think about political economy of development and growth, obviously there are many topics, but I think one topic that sort of may have been somewhat underemphasized so far may be that a lot of that political economy conflict is about control and coercion of labor. And realizing that if it's true might have some implications, it tends to have somewhat sharp implications in some stylized models, and it also seems to have potential for affecting the political dynamics in rather interesting dimensions. So it might be a fruitful area for thinking more about in the future.
Thank you, Daron. We have time for questions. Joel.
So Daron, I've seen this before, and I love this stuff, as you know, but I really want you to explain to me and to the audience, where does coercion end and monopoly, or monopoly, depending on where you're looking at, begin? Because that's, of course, tricky in your story. I mean, I understand it with slavery. Okay, you take In slavery South, you take black slaves, okay, and not only that you make them work, say, harder, but you make them work in forms that they would not have agreed to, right? Gang labor, by and large, disappears after 1865. Serfdom is different. Russian serfs really were coerced only in the sense that they could not leave. They were also supposed to do certain corvées and things like that, but that was relatively minor. The main thing is they were tied to the land. Okay, now what does that do? Well, that creates basically a monopoly for the guy who rents them land, and so he can charge them a higher rent. These markets become uncompetitive, okay? And in that sense, it's not all that different from 19th century France, where each worker, you know, his employer has to sign a livret, and if he doesn't sign it, the guy leaves to look for another employer, okay? He may not actually be able to be ever employed again, so you're tied to your employer. And you know, that is a form of coercion, but it strikes me that it's very different than the kind of coercion that you were describing earlier in your talk.
So I think I agree entirely that it's different, but I would say they, you know, obviously it's multidimensional, but let me reduce it to one dimension, and I would say that they're a softer form of coercion. So the Master and Servants Act, or what you're describing in France, you know, are much, much softer than serfdom, and serfdom itself is much, much softer than, you know, probably colony that the Romans had, and which is in terms much, much softer than slavery. But I think they're all about the same thing, which is that they are forcing you to accept terms of employment that you would not accept otherwise. And the reason for that, I think, is precisely that they're trying to prevent you from walking away, whereas walking away would have either made you walk away or improved the terms of trade for you, because the threat of walking away would have changed things. Now, there is a similarity here with imperfect labor markets, in the sense that in imperfect labor markets, I might be bargaining with you, and you can expand some of these bargaining models such that in the process of bargaining, I might do costly or socially wasteful things in order to increase my bargaining power. So I'm definitely not claiming that the comparative statics that I get here couldn't be obtained in a model that I would call non-coercive. So I would call a bargaining model non-coercive. But what I'm saying is that in some sense, thinking of a model in which the terms of trade are determined not by the market, but by some other activities, that's what I'm defining coercion. So that's the key definition of coercion, is that our terms of trade, and whether you accept that employment relationship, is defining by something else. That's coercion. It's obviously endogenous. That opens a whole other kind of work.
So it can't be a one factory town where workers can't leave because there is no coercion, it's geography. So there may be a labor market below.
Yeah, if it's one factory town and the workers cannot leave at all. Now, I would probably not call that coercion, but that's getting into the gray area. But you might get some comparative statics similar to this, because it might well be that they can actually leave if there was a train service and the employer wants to ban the train service or something like that. So
while we wait for other questions, let me ask two questions which are related. The first one, can I think of organized labor in a symmetric way, as you discussed coercion as attempts to raise the reservation wage, and then you would get all kinds of implications about the emergence of organized labor. The second question is on the technology for exerting coercion. So if I think of very harsh slavery conditions, I wouldn't have started with a participation constraint, but rather with a technology that induces more effort directly to the agent. So I hit you if you don't put enough effort. I cause stronger and harsher disutility if you don't put effort, or I monitor you with additional means. So wouldn't that lead to very different implications if you think about these forms of harsh slavery?
So excellent questions, as usual. So absolutely on the first one, and absolutely on the second one. So let me try to say more. So on the first one, that's absolutely right. So you can get, essentially, if an employer is slave to an employee and cannot get rid of the employee, then you're going to get exactly the same sort of thing. Now the employee is going to do lots of inefficient things in order to make the employer not leave or change the terms of trade. And in some sense, that's why I think it's very is somewhat misleading to think of the labor movement and the trade unions as a monolithic thing throughout history. So if you look at the origins of the labor movement, they were trying to prevent coercion. And then once labor movement kind of develops and becomes well established, and essentially a lot of its rights gets legally recognized, then it becomes a somewhat more rent-seeking thing. So it probably still, in many parts of the country, might still have a useful role in preventing coercion, but probably that's a minor part of its role. But so in that sense, I think the questions that you're sort of raising is right, but it also means that we might want to think about it very differently in developing versus developed countries. So for instance, the literature on child labor, for instance, is somewhat, I find somewhat confusing in this respect, in the sense that there are people who say child labor is immoral, and there are a lot of economists who say, well, child labor is great because look at it, you're creating income for poor families. I think the key question is how much of that child labor takes place on terms that actually the children and their families wouldn't want to have. Once you have the child labor institution, that's going to create a lot of things around it in order for employers to get this cheap form of labor. So I think that those are the sort of issues, is that once you have those institutions, what are the other things they do? And that sort of relates to this to the point you made. On the moral hazard, you're absolutely right. All of the comparative statics that I gave depend crucially on moral hazard and coercion. So take away the moral hazard, you get rid of 70% of the comparative statics. But I would argue that you shouldn't get rid of moral hazard, in the sense that even when you are so powerful as you have, coercive capacity, I think you don't get rid of the problem that information is imperfect. And I think if you read through the literature, at least my reading is that a major constraint for kind of coercive labor employers is to actually make sure that workers put effort. So in fact, the kind of the motivating workers or monitoring workers problem might get more severe, not less severe with coercion. Of course, you can put so much coercion that you can get the workers to do what you want, but that doesn't change the comparative statics, because that's an equilibrium outcome, that in equilibrium you're using a lot of coercion so that the workers really are afraid. But that still the information technology is such that you cannot costlessly observe the exact effort level that the worker puts.
Okay, so we can stop here. Thank you very much, and we can move on.